Fellow Falcoholics, what is up? Welcome to episode 247 of the Falcoholic Live. I'm your host, Kevin Knight, at Falcoholic Kevin on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Adnan Ikic. Once again, Adnan, how are you doing on this summer evening?
I'm doing well. We are in prime dead season territory. Early July, but we're still here every week.
Yep. Yeah, I remember back in the day we'd go to like every other week, but then people would constantly ask like, "So you guys like doing a show this week?" Or like, you guys want it, so we appreciate that. And as long as you guys are tuning in, we'll continue to do it. So it is the slow season. There's not a lot of news, so we figured we'd take the time to talk about some topics that we've been asked about. And on last week's show, Eric Robinson and I talked before the show about who the NFL's most tortured fan base is, and it was actually a little bit more interesting than I anticipated, and we decided to go ahead and do it, and talk about it, because it's actually a more complicated question, I think, that people realize. Because how do you determine who the most tortured fan base is? Is it most recently? Is it all time? Most tortured in terms of the Super Bowls, or lack of playoffs, or just lack of overall success? There's a lot to consider in this, and are the Falcons the current crown holder for that? We're going to determine that. We have not given our opinions to each other before the show, so it'll be a little bit of an adventure as we go through that. But yeah, I think it's an interesting topic, Adnan. I imagine you have some takes on this. Eric had very strong takes about the Falcons being, or should be, considered at least in like the top three. But I'm curious to see where you land on this.
Well, I mean, the Falcons are definitely up there.
Yeah,
If we're talking about singular moments, I don't think, or singular games, I don't think any other team or any other fan base has felt the pain that Falcons fans have felt when it came to, Super Bowl 51. Blowing a 28-3 lead in the Super Bowl just dwarfs everything else in a vacuum.
yeah.
Like, I think that's one of those games where it doesn't matter what any other fan base has ever felt throughout its history. I don't think the pain levels have ever matched, and probably will never match in NFL history what Falcons fans felt when it came to that singular game.
Yeah, no, I think
Now,
yeah. No, that's
go ahead, continue.
sorry. Yeah, I got it. I think you're about to go into like a serious thing, so I want to make sure I get this ad read in. I have to get it in the first 5 minutes. The contract stipulates, but
Oh, okay, of course.
no, but you're absolutely right, and I think that we should dig deeper on that topic right after this. I probably should have done the ad read before I teed you up, so I just really just tease the fans there with that. But guys, I do want to bring you a quick word from our sponsor, betonline.ag, your number one source for all your betting needs. You can get the latest odds, lines, and matchup reports for baseball, boxing, golf, and more. Perhaps you're feeling overly confident in the Falcons, or feeling good about some other NFL futures. You can bet on those right now before the rest of the league catches up after training camp. No matter what you do, though, guys, BetOnline is your sports intel headquarters this season, as they've got you covered for all your insider sports wagering needs. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info, including live betting options and your favorite casino and card games you can play right from your home. So head to the website today, or use your mobile device to get in on the action. Be sure to use our promo code BELIEVE. It's the same as our producer here, BLEAV, to receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Again, guys, that promo code is BELIEVE, BLEAV. Bet online, where the game starts. All right, Adnan, apologies for the tease, but I do think you raise a really good point, and that this is why this is more complicated, because I think you're right. Like, if you're just talking about like one game, it's going to be hard to top that for the Falcons.
No, like, I think the only game that can, even feasibly come close is the Oilers blowing the Circle of the Wagons game, against Frank Reich and the Bills. What was it, 1993, 1994?
Mm-hmm.
One of the, where they blew the biggest playoff lead in NFL history, the 35-3 lead, but that wasn't the Super Bowl. Like, like, I don't know if they would have like even won the Super Bowl had they won that game. So when you're talking about singular moments, the Falcons have everyone beat. But when you're talking about the entire body of the fan base, like, what are we looking at it in the Super Bowl era is a big question, or are we looking at it like, we're putting four 108-year-old men who are fans of each team, or like a series of 100 like 5 to 110-year-old men who are fans of each team, lifelong fans, and like who's more tortured? So is it like, are we looking at it just in the Super Bowl era, or is it like, everything throughout human history?
Right, and it's complicated, right? It's not an easy question to answer, and I think there's a lot of things you can look at, right? I think if you look at, like we said, single game, Falcons obviously have a great a great claim to that one. If you're talking about recent history, like last 10 years, I certainly wouldn't think it would be the Falcons like overall. Obviously, we had that very
No.
painful moment, but we've also had a lot of success like over the last 10 years. So,
Like overall, if we're looking at it since this, so I have, I think my top five is pretty set in stone. So I'm not going to put in any rankings yet, like probably later on in the show. But my top five in terms of most tortured fan bases, one of them is the Minnesota Vikings, given the fact that they have lost four Super Bowls. Most of those, one of them happened in 1969, and the other ones happened way back in the 70s. So they were losing to the best teams out of the AFC. So they lost three out of four Super Bowls. They've lost plenty of NFC championship games, and they have their own. If we're talking about the most singular, like painful game ever, the Falcons are number one. I would say the Vikings have a strong claim to number two, losing that 1998 NFC title game, with Gary Anderson missing that field goal, because that Vikings team would have won that Super Bowl. I don't doubt that they would have crushed the Broncos in the Super Bowl, and you can ask any Vikings fan, and they would probably tell you the same thing. That team went 15-1. Randy Moss was lighting the world on fire. They had Chris Carter, they had Randall Cunningham. Like that team was that team should be lauded as one of the best teams of all time, but they aren't, because their all-world kicker just happened to miss a chip shot for him
yeah.
in a dome.
Yeah. It's crazy.
And even beyond that, we remember the Vikings losing the NFC title game in 2009, to the Saints, the Bountygate Saints, who were had a bounty on Brett Favre's head. But because Brett Favre in field goal range decided to be Brett Favre and throw the ball crossbody inexplicably, I think the Vikings would have probably won that Super Bowl too, against the Colts. So the Vikings have had some nice success over the years, over the past decade. They haven't been like a nothing team. They've gone to the playoffs plenty of times. They've won, a handful of playoff games. They got some revenge on the Saints a couple times. But even their Minneapolis Miracle, they came out the next week and lost another NFC Championship game. I definitely think that someone who has been watching Vikings games since since their inception would probably argue their placement at the top of that list. I mean, maybe we can get Evan's dad as a guest on the show. I know he's a big Vikings fan.
Yeah.
After the Vikings, we have to mention the Buffalo Bills. That's up there in your neck of the woods right now, up in Syracuse. The Bills, I just couldn't imagine losing four straight Super Bowls. Just at one point, like losing one was already hard enough, and,
Right.
and I know that there's the argument of like of course you get to the Super Bowl and it was a magical season and the K gun was absolutely explosive, and Thurman Thomas was all world, former MVP. Mark Levy just had that team firing on all cylinders. But man, can you imagine just getting to the big game year after year and every year losing it? And we talk about the singular most painful games. The Bills have their own claim for number two with Scott Norwood missing the field goal in 1990, which would have won them that Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the Bills had that very long playoff drought after the Music City Miracle. They had to suffer through the Music City Miracle in '99, and then they didn't make the playoffs for another 18 years after that. Like, can you imagine if the Falcons? We've already had a 5-year drought. Can you imagine
Yeah.
if we had 13 more years
Right.
of this? Um, After the Bills, another team of my top 5, of course, the Cleveland Browns. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the Browns. If we're talking about all time, like human history, the Browns had a lot of success in
Yeah.
the 50s and 60s. They had the Jim Brown era. They won what 4 NFL championships. Like that team was a dynasty back in the day. But in the Super Bowl era, they they've been shit.
Yeah.
Like they did make a couple of title games which they lost, or a couple NFL
Right.
championships
Right.
because that then it was the NFL AFL, so that's the equivalent of a conference championship. They had they had in 1987 they suffered the fumble where Bynard fumbled the ball at the 1 yard line, which right before they were about to go to the Super Bowl. In '89 they lost to the Broncos off the drive. I think that was 1989, or no, excuse me, that was 1986. My mistake. But they had suffered through the fumble in the drive against the Broncos against John Elway. Their fan base lost their team for a few years because of terrible ownership. Then they had to suffer through their own playoff drought. They had to suffer an 0-16 season. They had a 2-year stretch where they went 1-31, and now they're kind of coming back. But even now they have to pay Deshaun Watson like what $60 million in cap hit year after year.
Right. Right.
Um, and the last team in my top 5, and I mean it's probably a top 6. Uh, the Detroit Lions have 1 playoff win since 1954.
Yeah.
They have squandered arguably the greatest running back in NFL history, Barry Sanders, retired early because of how shit that franchise was. Arguably the greatest pure wide receiver in NFL history, Calvin Johnson, who was a first
Yeah.
ballot Hall of Famer. He retired early because of how shit that ownership was.
Right.
And I mean, the best thing that Lions fans have had going for them in the past number of decades is their former quarterback, Matthew Stafford, winning a Super Bowl. That team, whenever they make the playoffs, they lose it. They lost in a heartbreaking fashion against the Cowboys in 2014. And I mean, that team has just been a fucking dumpster fire. Like you look at their banners, and like their banners are so like sad. It's like 2011 NFL playoff appearance, and that's one of their banners. They haven't won their division since 1993, which I mean that seems like inconceivable. And then you have the Arizona Cardinals, who have been in existence over 100 years with no Super Bowl. They made it one time and lost in heartbreaking fashion in 2008. I said top 5, but that's a top 6. I think it's those 6 teams for me, and then like everyone else is just like a tier below.
Distant. Yeah, like you brought up most of the ones I was going to talk about too. We can dive into the rankings on them, but I think recently, like I do want to shout out the Chargers because they've just been on the receiving end of some just really, really atrocious bad luck. And then of course they blew that playoff game, which I think displaced the 28-3 as the biggest playoff game blown lead ever. So, they've just suffered through that. So I think the Chargers are deserving of at least a shout out here. Then there's teams that either have been moved a bunch of times. Like you mentioned the Browns, they've had their team moved several times. So that obviously plays a part. And then I would throw Washington in there too, dealing with terrible ownership for so long. And looks like thankfully that's on the way out. But that's pretty terrible as well. So
I think Washington, if we're talking about recent, last 20 years, that team is just. I don't think that team has. I mean, they won their division as a 7-win team in 2020.
Yeah.
They won it. They won it the RG3 year, and they won it as a 9-win team in 2015. But yeah, Washington in the past decade, for sure, because you just think about it. They had an electric superstar in RG3, and he tears his ACL in their first playoff appearance together, and he's never the same after that. They have to deal with Dan Snyder. They have to it's been tough. It's been tough for Washington fans. Like
Yeah.
I think there was like a list, like someone shared a list of like the last time any team has won 11 games, and every team in the NFL like has won 11 games within the last like 15 or so years. Then you have Washington where like their last 11 plus win season was 1991,
Yeah.
which is. But if we're talking about all time, they did have the Hogs. In fairness, they had a couple, or they had three Super Bowl wins in a 10-year span between the 80s and 90s. Like that team was so good in the 80s. They had the greatest offensive line of all time.
Yeah.
I don't think we can put them in like a full all time, but if we're talking about recent, then they're definitely up there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough to rank because there's so many factors, and we brought up a lot of good ones.
It's very
Man,
subjective.
it is. It is. And like you mentioned, like the Falcons obviously have their claims as well. I don't think I would put them at number one, so we could probably put, we don't want to keep people guessing as to if we're going to put the Falcons at one. I'm not going to put them at one. The Super Bowl was terrible. If you want to say like one game, then I won't argue with you for being like that's the most torturous game that has ever been, lived through by a fan base.
But in fairness, before we start ranking, we do have to give the Falcons their due in this as well.
Yes.
So it's
Yeah,
not just the Super Bowl. Like
it's not.
it's not. I'm not looking at this as, just. Uh, I'm not looking at this as, oh yeah, the Falcons lost Super Bowl 51 and that's why they're like tortured. I mean, in that case, like the Seahawks lost Super Bowl, or the Seahawks lost their own Super Bowl, and in also heartbreaking fashion with the Malcolm Butler interception. But we're not going to rank the Seahawks in this because they won the Super Bowl a few years earlier. Like the Falcons, remember, had 2012 the 17-0 blown lead against the 49ers in the NFC Championship game. The Falcons were absolutely terrible up until Matt Ryan came along. Like they had absolutely terrible ownership. They suffered through their doldrums in the 80s. Their best chance at a Super Bowl, pre Matt Ryan and pre 1998, I would say their best chance, other than 2012 and 2016 ever, was that 1980 season where they blew a lead against the Cowboys. That was a 12-win team.
Yeah.
They got clobbered in the Super Bowl in '98, but nobody really expected them to win that one. They had arguably the biggest box office superstar in the NFL, Michael Vick, in his prime, get arrested for dogfighting. I think that plays into it as well. So we're not having this conversation just because of the Super Bowl. It's just the Super Bowl was the cherry on top of the sundae, losing in that fashion to the the Patriots. But this team has its own like set of torture. It has its own demons. The 2010 season where they got clobbered by the Packers after a 13-win year, for example. Even losing that game against the Eagles where Keanu Neal's knee pretty much cost them that one, where they had a decent chance of probably making it back to the Super Bowl. So, I mean, it's more than just one thing when it comes to the Falcons.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And we are one of the more pained fan bases, guys, so don't worry about that. We're not trying to get out of giving the Falcons their credit, but you brought up some really good points, Adnan, and I just don't. There's a lot of tribulations Falcons fans have gone through. There hasn't, like up until recently, there really hasn't been much playoff success at all, so we've been able to benefit from that. If you take the last like decade out, this team has basically no playoff success whatsoever. So they've improved it quite a bit, and I think it helps that I think we're going into another positive era here, or at least that's the hope, right? But the Falcons are like pretty far down the list in terms of playoff wins, and they've been to the playoffs only 14 times so far, which is I think like tied for like the fifth fewest or sixth fewest of any team. They're tied with the Saints, funny enough, the Jets, the Ravens, but technically the Baltimore Ravens have only been around since '96. So, and they're only ahead of a handful of teams, most of which you mentioned the Arizona Cardinals, of course, but the other three that are much lower on the list have only been around since the mid '90s, and one of them is the Houston Texans, who didn't even come around until 2002. So, it's this is a team that really hasn't had a lot of success. They've only, have 10 playoff wins under their belt. And they do have the 2 Super Bowls, 2 NFC South, I think, NFC Championship appearances. So they've done like a decent job when they've gotten to the playoffs. They're not in the same boat as like, what, like you mentioned, the Minnesota Vikings, who, have basically just been hosed in their trips to the playoffs, even though they have 31 seasons in the playoffs, still haven't, gotten to the promised land, right? Still haven't won that Super Bowl. So the Falcons haven't done a great job, but given, that they're not one of the OG teams like the Cardinals, who've been around since 1920, only have 11 playoff appearances. It's, not great. So I think that the Falcons definitely have a claim on the top 5 at least, but anything more than that, I think there's probably, historically speaking, I think there's teams that have a better claim to being the most tortured fan base than the Falcons. But that Super Bowl definitely rocketed them up the rankings quite a bit, to where it's not outlandish to talk about them in this conversation. But don't want to linger too long on that game either, unfortunately, for us. But we survived it, and I hope we've got some better things in store now. Kind of coming out of the end of this downward spiral that happened after the Super Bowl, and hopefully back on the come up here. But we won't be able to figure that out probably for another 6 weeks until we actually see this team start playing football. So interesting stuff, of course. And before we dive back into our rankings here, do want to remind folks, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Really appreciate that. If you're listening to the podcast audio later, leave us that 5-star review. Anyone who's interested in helping support us getting down to training camp, we are running our training camp fundraiser right now. We're doing we're pretty good. We got 26 days left. For over 33% of the way funded. So thank you all so much for everyone who's already donated. The link to that's in the show description. Streamlabs.com/thefalcoholic/tip. Appreciate everyone who's already pitched in there. Make sure you throw in a question if you got questions for us to answer. And then also wanted to give you guys a fun update here for training camp. And that is that this is not 100% official in terms of the date, but it's very close to being official that we will be hosting our first either Falcoholic live fan meetup or Falcoholic live taping at the Sweetwater Brewing in Atlanta during the first week of training camp. We are still ironing out the details. I should have more information for you guys by early next week about the exact day, but I believe it will be Friday the 28th, probably be that evening after practice, and we just wanted to give everyone a heads up because it's a great brewery, and they're excited to host the show, and we'll see, technically if it can support us doing a live show there, then we will do so. If not, we'll just do like a live hangout or something like that, but it's going to be a lot of fun. Look forward to the future, to the official announcement of that real soon. But we hope to see some folks there. I think it'll be a lot of fun. So, returning to the topic du jour of the most tortured fan bases, you brought up a lot of good ones. Let's like do a top 5, just for so we can nail a takedown. Because I keep like wanting to mentally change where I have guys ranked. So I think we're going to have to nail this down, but Adnan, I'll let you go first. We'll start at 5 and sort of work our way up. Who do you have at 5?
Number 5. Man, this is really hard.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
Like it is very subjective. Number 5, I would, I came in saying I had a top 5 and then I forgot about the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, that's what I forgot about them too. Yeah,
because they're so irrelevant. Like just in general, like who thinks about the fucking Arizona Cardinals?
Right.
Like, when's the last time you like sat down and like been like, oh, thought anything of the Arizona Cardinals, like at all? I'll put them at number 5. I'll put the Cardinals at number 5, and that actually bumps the Bills off the top 5 for me. And I think the only reason why I would bump the Bills off two reasons. One is, yeah, they lost 4 straight Super Bowls in the 90s, which is brutal, but they still experienced 4 AFC championship wins. Like, they still experienced like those years of magic.
Yeah.
And it's the Falcons also like experienced a year of magic in 2016, the Vikings in 1998, but I feel like it's different. I feel like Bills fans can kind of even look back on those years and been like, hey, like those years were really fun. Those years were really good. Like, the K-gun offense, Thurman Thomas, like, that was really fun, and they can look back, reminisce like very fondly. We can never reminisce on 2016 again, because every time we reminisce on that, we always have to go to the Super Bowl. The Vikings can never reminisce on 1998 again because it'll always go back to the Gary Anderson miss.
Yeah.
And the other reason is the Bills, they have something brewing right now. Like, the Buffalo Bills are in the middle of what could be a really, really good era. They have 3 straight division title wins, 2 of those 13-win seasons. It feels like they're really close to a breakthrough. And yeah, they still have to get through the Kansas City Chiefs, but they have a top 2 quarterback in the NFL and an MVP candidate in Josh Allen. And the Bills have one of the probably a top 5 future in the NFL right now if we were to do those rankings, where the Falcons would not be in the top 5 of those.
Right.
Hopefully in a few years.
Hopefully
maybe,
we're getting. Let's get to the top 15, then we'll get to the top 10. I'm hoping by the end of this season we'll be like maybe in the top 10 going into next year, like because we'll have had like a better season. Yeah. But it's gonna take some time, I think.
Now, a decade from now, when we're still doing the show, and when our viewers are still like here,
of course,
maybe we'll be looking back and maybe we'll be like, oh man, the Bills squandered another like amazing era because they had to be unlucky to face the brick wall that is Pat Mahomes' Kansas City Chiefs. Much in the same way that a lot of NBA teams in the 90s, were ready for a title, but, they just were unlucky to be in Michael Jordan's era.
Right.
So, maybe that'll be one of those things with the Bills, but we can't really say that for sure yet. Because who knows? Maybe the Bills get to the Super Bowl this year. That wouldn't be very far-fetched. So, I'm off on a tangent right now. So
no,
I have the Arizona Cardinals, the
at
very
5.
Irrelevant Arizona Cardinals at 5.
Okay.
Yeah, they just haven't. They did suffer that heartbreak in the Super Bowl in 2008, but they just don't have those singular games of just like pure devastation. And even beyond that, they had a pretty good run. Like, the Kurt Warner era with Larry Fitzgerald. That team won 13 games in 2015. That was with Carson Palmer, but they had that explosive playoff win against the Packers in 2009. That team's had some recent success ish, kind of.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good one. Yeah. No, I think I'm also gonna land on them. It's honestly like they probably deserve to be higher, but like the things you said, like they're sort of like not important enough to be higher, like sadly, and that's why they're at 5. It's sort of like they're so irrelevant that like I can't even put them higher because it's just like it doesn't matter that much. So sorry, Cardinals fans, but maybe that's a justification for you being even higher on this list. I don't know, but yeah, I think I agree with you there, and I'll take the first stab at number 4. This one's a little bit challenging. There's a lot of teams I'd like to put here. It's tough to like slot them in. Man, I don't know. I guess I think I'm gonna go with the Vikings here, just because like they're very tortured, but they have had a lot of success. It hasn't translated to like Super Bowls. But in terms of like, I mean, they've been in the play. They're like top 5 a number of years. They've been in the playoffs. So this is a team that's had a lot of success over the years. And yes, it hasn't translated, but that's a lot of winning seasons. I mean, I think the Vikings are like almost 100 games over 500. So like they've had some very tough times and some very tough games in particular that are very memorable, but they've also had a lot of success. So those really like devastating moments get them in the top 5, but I have a hard time putting them any higher because of that aforementioned success.
I feel like the viewers are going to accuse us of being too agreeable, as they
Is that
sometimes
what you
are.
do? That's
Yeah,
funny.
because I mean, I've had like, yeah, I've read those comments of, oh, nobody ever disagrees on the Falcoholic. Like,
We got to bring
sorry,
Crossfire back. Yeah, it will
yeah,
force us to disagree. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I have the Vikings at number four, like for the same reasons that you mentioned. Like, they have had their they have had their demons, and I mentioned 1998. I mentioned 2009. Like, those were fucking painful,
Yeah.
painful ass moments.
Right.
But they've had a rich history beyond not being able to win the Super Bowl. Like, imagine if they win one of those Super Bowls in the 60s or in the 70s,
Right.
then we're talking about the Vikings as, like, one of those rich NFL like franchises. Have you noticed how we haven't even mentioned the Jets yet?
Yeah.
Like, we haven't mentioned the Jets in this entire conversation in this half hour, purely because they won that one Super Bowl in 1968 with Joe Namath. But the Jets have had their own tortured out. The Jets have gone 8 straight years actively without making the playoffs. Like, the
Yeah.
Jets have, I don't think they've ever had a 4,000 yard passer, in
Right.
their history. They had a couple good years at the beginning of the Rex Ryan era with Darrelle Revis and that amazing defense in '09 and 2010. But like, that's the difference. Like, you win that one title like in your history, and all of a sudden you're not on this list. And the Vikings have come so close to that. And if they do win that title, we're talking about the Vikings as, one of those strong franchises. I would absolutely trade. I would trade the Falcons history for the Vikings history in an instant. Like, personally, being a Falcons fan, sure, it sucks. Like, those moments have been ass, but they have had those moments. They have been in those positions for a reason. They've had some good years. They just won 13 games last year. They were a 13-win team in 2017. They had the Minneapolis Miracle. Like, can you? Uh, I had I had such euphoria, like, like, not being a Vikings fan, just because I fucking hate the Saints in that moment. I couldn't imagine, like, I couldn't imagine the Falcons, like, having like a singular moment like that where you snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. And I mean, even moving forward, because we do have to look at these franchises moving forward too. Uh, they have the second coming of Julio Jones in Justin Jefferson, who's gonna probably be the best wide receiver in the NFL for the next half decade plus. It's some exciting times for them as well. But yeah, I think they've had too much success, even without a Super Bowl, to be in the top three.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. All right. Who do you have third? And I hope it's not the same as me this time.
I have the Falcons third.
Okay.
I I do think we have had our demons. We have had a tortured history, and I can't imagine. We have some older readers, some older listeners who have been, who've been with it since the 60s, who've been with it, since the very beginning. And, you guys, I absolutely tip my cap to you guys. I salute you guys for all you've been through. And, you guys are the ones that deserve a title more than anyone else, because, this team has put you through way too much fucking shit, in all honesty.
Yeah.
The Falcons, the Super Bowl loss does catapult. I think if the Falcons lose to the Packers in that NFC title game, and if they never even make that Super Bowl, I don't think we're even talking about them in the top five. Like, I think I would have put the Bills at five, and the Falcons wouldn't have been in the top five, like, whatsoever. Would have been in the top 10 for sure, but the Super Bowl definitely, like you said, shoots them up the list. In a fair world, well, not fair, but in a less tortured world, the Falcons would have the credentials to be number one. Like, they do have the credentials to be number one, but I think the two franchises that I'm putting above them, I think the pain that they've gone through is just too immense.
Yeah. No, that's very fair. Yeah. I don't have the same team number three. I actually don't. I'm not putting the Falcons in the top five. I would have them 6. But I think they're right on the cusp. I just they're not as pained as some of these teams. And you brought up definitely some good points there. I'm not at all disagreeing with any of that. But yeah, I think, let's see, for 3, I think I'm going to end up going with the Buffalo Bills here. With those 4 straight Super Bowl losses, that's just so challenging to live through. And like the Bills outside of that have had a fair amount of success. But that those 4 Super Bowls just really, I think, sort of lift them. Even though they've had this recent run where they've been very good and they're almost 500 overall, like they're pretty, they're not doing too bad in terms of the win-loss record, and they've been to the playoffs over 20 times. So they've not been as bad as some, but yeah, I think that the Bills get that 3 spot, and I pray that nobody else ever has to go through losing 4 straight Super Bowls. That's just, I feel like I would just be so tapped out at that point. But Bills fans are one of the most passionate fan bases, so props to those guys. They weathered the storm, and they're as passionate as ever these days. So
yeah, and in fairness, like neither of us lived through that in Buffalo, but they did have that really, really good 30 for 30, the 4 Falls of Buffalo, where they talked about it, and they talked with Bills fans about it. And I mean, if you haven't watched it, I definitely recommend checking that out. But definitely, I mean, I definitely see your point on that one. Like it would be hard to live through. Like the only thing that they're lucky about is it wasn't in the social media era.
Yeah,
because that would be so fucking
gosh.
brutal. Like, can you imagine?
That would be just terrible. Yeah, absolutely wild stuff. All right, my number 2, I'm going to be going with the Cleveland Browns, which is probably not going to surprise anybody. Definitely one of the most pained franchises in the NFL. They actually had some success like really early on, but this is a team that's been moved multiple times. They've lost their team. It's come back. Like that's something that Falcons fans have not thankfully had to deal with. And I think that definitely is something that rockets them ahead. That team has been, poorly owned for quite some time. They're dealing with their own modern fiasco, which adds even some more flair to the ranking. And, they did have a lot of, like I said, they had a lot of early success that's really like buoyed them. But, this is still a team that is under 500 in the playoffs. Even though they do have quite a few appearances there, they've also never reached the promised land. So I do think the Browns have a strong claim as being one of the most tortured fan bases from an off-field perspective as well as an on-field one. Who do you have number 2, Adnan?
Well, I think we'll only have one disagreement in our top 5 because I also have the Browns at number 2.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, that I feel like the Browns could even have a claim at number 1. Like
they could,
that fan base has been through so fucking much.
Yeah.
They did win. They did have that fun playoff win against the Steelers, but before that, that's their first playoff win since 1994. That's their first playoff appearance since 1994. This team has drafted so many busts at the quarterback position year after year. Like there's that famous jersey of that one Browns fan that they have where they cross out the name of every quarterback, and it's the list is so long they made a second column on it too.
Yeah. Legendary.
They've just been fucking heinously owned. I mentioned it date back to the 80s. They had to live through the drive. They had to live through the fumble. And some of those Browns teams were maybe even good enough with Marty Schottenheimer to win it all. And I think another thing that sort of twists the knife, which we haven't mentioned, the Cleveland Browns lost their football team in 1996. They got it back in 1999 because I feel like the NFL came to its senses and realized that Cleveland needs to have a football team. Like that fan base is too passionate, and that fan base is too good to not have a football team. That's a football town over there. But they lost their team, and that team became the Baltimore Ravens. The Baltimore Ravens they've had a lot of success since leaving Cleveland. Not right away, but can you imagine losing a team and then watching that team win a Super Bowl just 4 years after you lose them?
Yeah.
Or excuse me,
Brutal.
5 years after you lose them. And then can you imagine watching that team have an immense amount of success year after year, in that Joe Flacco era of just making the playoffs every single year? I think there was one, two, three, four, five. They had 5 straight years where they won at least one playoff game, 6 out of 7 years where they won at least one playoff game, and they won another Super Bowl in 2012, which was a magical run. Like all while the poor people of Cleveland had to watch their beloved Cleveland Browns win 4 to 5 games year after year, while the city that took their team has had all of this success.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't watch hockey that much anymore since the Atlanta Thrashers lost their hockey team. I used to be big on hockey, yeah. So the Thrashers lost their team in 2011. Before that, I watched every hockey game the way I watch every basketball game now and every Falcons game now. But even though I don't really follow it as much anymore, and I hope to when Atlanta gets a team again, I have dedicated my life to rooting against the Winnipeg Jets, who took the Thrashers, because I can't bear to watch them have the type of success to win a title with my city's team. That's my team. That should be my team. Those should be the guys. I should be the one celebrating.
Yeah.
Not these Canadians. And that's. I feel like that adds another layer to the heartbreak of Cleveland sports fans, even if they had that success in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right there, and it losing your team is brutal, and as long as Arthur Blank's the owner, the Falcons aren't going anywhere. We know that, and Atlanta's a great sports city. I don't think we have too much to worry about with losing the Falcons, but I can only imagine what that would be like. It'd be absolutely brutal. And the Browns have had it happen, I believe, multiple times. So it's tough being a Browns fan. So I don't envy those guys whatsoever. All right, Adnan, who's your number one? I think we all know, but
it has to be the Lions.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the Lions have been. Can you imagine winning one playoff game, and what's it been since 1957? They won the NFL championship in 1957, and they won NFL playoff bowls in the early 60s, but they've won one playoff game in what? How many years has it been? 70
God.
years?
It's
71 years? How? How do you fucking live through this as a Detroit sports fan? How do you bear going into every single year pretty much knowing your team is going to be shit? Because that's pretty much been the Lions' existence. They had a little bit of success with the Matthew Stafford era. They made the playoffs a few years, but they've been the NFC North's punching bag year in and year out. It's pretty much been the Packers, Vikings, and Bears just taking turns. Whoever's at the top of that division just absolutely shitting on the Lions every single year. They've been so poorly owned that Barry Sanders retired early. A generational talent. They've had two generational talents, arguably the GOATs at their positions. And I know Jerry Rice is the greatest receiver of all time, but from a pure wide receiver standpoint, Calvin Johnson has an argument. There's a reason why he was a first ballot Hall of Famer, despite the short end to his career. And, you sort of just drove him away because of how inept you were. And, even to this day, there's a really contentious relationship between Calvin Johnson and the Detroit Lions, because the owners they're withholding his signing bonus or whatever petty shit it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's just stupid. Yeah.
That team is, I don't know. I couldn't imagine being a Lions fan. I'm sorry. And they have they have a bit of a bright future now, brighter than they have had before. But also I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the 0-16 season in 2008. And I know the Browns went 0-16 too, but when you're the first team in a 16 game season to go winless, and I mean that team was just absolutely pulverized
Oh yeah.
in every single game. That's a special level of just inept, and we have to, Lions fans every single Thanksgiving have to wake up and watch their normally below 500 team normally lose on Thanksgiving, normally and normally have their hearts broken regarding any playoff chances. It's been better recently, but I don't know, man. That's just I don't know. I don't know if I could bear being a lifelong Lions fan, like one of those guys in his like 70s, 80s, just like being a diehard Lions fan year in and year out.
Yeah, I mean it's got to be the Lions number one. It's just this is one of the oldest teams in the NFL. They've been around since 1930, and they have in 36 more years of being an NFL franchise, the Lions have 3 more playoff appearances than the Falcons, and they have 3 less wins. So, and that's in 36 more seasons that they had the opportunity to go to the playoffs. I mean, that's just so rare. Like 17 out of like over 70, 17 out of 73 years they've been to the playoffs. It's just so low, and it's just so brutal. And it's like they don't have the excuse of being a newer team, right? I mean, you look at the Jaguars and the Texans and the Panthers, those teams. And it's like, okay, well, they don't have a lot of playoff wins, but they were a new team. It takes a while to get going. You're going to be bad for a while before you get going. And so they have a little bit of a pass, but man, Detroit, it's that team has lost. I think the team has lost more games than the Falcons have played, or something, or almost. So it's brutal.
I mean, they've lost over 700 games, and I would like to correct myself. Their last playoff win was in 1991, not 1993. I was looking at their last division title was in 1993, which is also very shit. It's been what, 30 years?
Yeah. That's a lot. It's still a really long time, regardless. But man, yeah. So
yeah, it's brutal. Like the
is.
Lions fans, you get the crown. You get the crown.
You do.
Of being the most,
Congratulations.
Like I would not.
Yeah.
I would take being a Falcons fan over being a Lions fan any day.
Oh
yeah. And I feel like if we were to look at the tiers, it would be the Lions and Browns, and then there would be a gap, and then after that gap, it will be everyone else. Like I feel like the only other fan base that has a claim to that crown is the Cleveland Browns, and I wouldn't be upset if anyone named it Browns Lions. This is all just personal preference, personal subjective opinions, but I think it's those two, and then everyone else is comfortably well behind them. Like this is a 2-horse race.
Yeah. No, I mean it's oof. It's a tough top 5 to crack, and I do have the Falcons at 6, and I think we could. There's obviously a lot of, there's honorable mentions that we've brought up as well. I think the Chargers are an honorable mention for sure. Interestingly enough, the Bucks are kind of a sneaky, tortured fan base as well. Obviously, they have the recent Super Bowl, so that
I think that's
gets
the only
rid of
thing,
a lot of it. Yeah,
they have 2 Super Bowls since the 2000s. Like
so that covers up a lot.
For 2 Super Bowls. Yeah.
But they are
like
yeah.
For some of these franchises, like 1 Super Bowl carries a lot of weight. Like 1 Super Bowl does a lot of work. I mentioned the Jets as like being one of them, where it's like, and their Super Bowl was in the 60s. Like most of their fan base wasn't even alive for that.
Yeah. I mean, it's man, it's tough, but yeah, I mean, the Bucks I think technically have like the worst win percentage of any team in the NFL. Still, they're at just over 400. So like, that is a team that has not been good, but they do have the 2 Super Bowls, so it just kind of neutralizes some of it. I think Jaguars are certainly up there as well. They've really
The
struggled
reason why I
lately.
wouldn't put the Jags and Texans is just because they're too new.
Yeah, they are relatively new. They've struggled a lot early, but the Texans really haven't. I mean, like recently, yes, but the Texans are almost 500. I mean, they're relatively close to 500.
Matt Schaub was good. Like
Yeah.
they had Andre Johnson. Like that team.
Yeah.
That team didn't win a Super Bowl, but it's like get in line. Like you've only been suffering since 2002. Like cry me a river.
It's not enough to crack the top 5, certainly. So
another team where in that category of 1 Super Bowl is doing a lot of work for them. We have to mention the New Orleans Saints. And their Super Bowl, some people, myself, would put an asterisk because they were dirty cheaters that year. So even their 1 Super Bowl, like, some people are looking at it like, oh, like, is that really like everyone else's Super Bowl? But sure, they won it. But beyond that, like they have had a lot of success in the Sean Payton era. We know that firsthand. They have beaten the Falcons a lot since 2006 because of Sean Payton. But, even throughout that decade of success, they have suffered through a lot of heartbreak. It's not like they've been irrelevant like the Cardinals. They were in that Cardinals level of irrelevance for a long time throughout their history. I think their first division title was in '91. I don't know if that was their first playoff appearance or not, but that was the year where they lost to the Falcons. But in this last decade where they have had that success, they had to suffer through that loss against the 49ers where Alex Smith hit Vernon Davis at the last second. They had to suffer through the Beast Quake. They had to suffer through the Minneapolis Miracle. They had to suffer through the no call in that Ram series, which that made their fan base go so wild, and it made them annoy the absolute ever living shit out of every other NFL fan base. So yeah, I would say I would give the Saints a little bit of an honorable mention, probably in the back end of the top 10.
Yeah, I think so. So they're all in there too. Yeah, I think we pretty much covered it. That was a pretty good, exhaustive ranking, I think. We hit on a lot of the main teams, guys. In the comments, leave us your own personal top 5 rankings of the most tortured fan bases. If you want to put the Falcons in the top 5, it's okay. You don't have to agree with us either. Right? And Adnan had them at 3, so there's clearly it's a deeply personal, subjective thing. So you're welcome to list the Falcons as high or as low as you want. But interesting conversation. It was a fun one. Really good topic for this time of year, I think, Adnan. And we're gonna next week we're gonna be able to transition to training camp preview stuff. So we needed to find something to just sort of get us through one more week of Dead Zone. But then next week, Adnan, we're gonna talk about the training camp battles to watch on offense. We'll be like doing our first training camp live preview, and then it'll be defense the week after that, and then it'll be camp. So 3 shows from now, guys, it'll be training camp. Huh? So we are almost there. We're getting there. Again, guys, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Like, subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Leave us that 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. You can check out the community Discord server in the show description. You can donate to the training camp fund, also in the show description, and you can also check out our Patreon if you're interested in getting involved with that. Patreon.com/Falcoholic Live. Tonight's show, of course, was brought to you by BetOnline. Adnan, before we take off, anything you're working on you'd like to plug?
Just plugging the website, thefalcoholic.com. We will be, we're still in the dead zone right now, but we will be doing a lot of extensive training camp reviews with each passing day when that time comes. Kevin and I will be tag teaming those. We'll be doing shows. Kevin mentioned the Sweetwater Brewery live show slash meetup.
Whatever, we'll figure it out. Details forthcoming, TBD. Yeah.
So definitely we're still, we still have a few more weeks to go. But it's going to be a lot of exciting stuff coming up here pretty soon, and it is one of the most exciting times of the year, and training camp time I think is one of the most important times for the Falcoholic.com, because I don't, no disrespect to anyone else, but I don't think anyone's covering this team at camp the way we are, and I don't think that they have covered it as well as we have the past couple of years and the past number of years, despite the fact that they have constantly have had more resources, and more time. Like neither of us. Yeah, you're flying in from New York. I'm taking PTO time to be at camp. We're not being like paid directly and paid a lot to be at camp the way like other people are. And yeah, I don't think, I think, I still don't think that they've done as good of a job as we have. And, we look forward to continuing to prove that this year as well, and continuing to have the most extensive coverage. And yeah, I mean, the commitment is there. Well, case in point with this show, we could have easily, I don't think anyone would have blamed us for taking the week off and, going into training camp battles next week. But, we're here in the most dead zone of dead zones talking about tortured fan bases.
Yep. Hey, and shout out to Eric Robinson for that show idea. That was a fun one, Eric. Thank you. And Eric just got his own promotion at ESPN, so congrats.
Yeah, congratulations
to Eric. Shout out. Really happy for him there. Yeah, guys, I got my, you guys can see I got my fancy tripod here for camp now, and also invested in a new phone with 10 times zoom. So Falcons, if you're going to try to hide those defensive line battles on the far field this year, I'm going to try to take a picture of them. We'll see how well that works out. But, theoretically it should work better. So nowhere to hide this year. You can't stuff them on the far field and make me, do terrible, crappy, grainy video. So, hey, that's just a little tease for you guys.
Last year they banned videos because of you for certain parts of camp. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if after this year they just tell us to just put our phones away at one point.
Well, now if we can record, I'm going to record. So hey, it's not my job to set the rules. It's my job to exploit them to the fullest. It's my job to get the content. It's their job to create the rules. So, hey, I'm excited to bring you guys that content. Excited to see you guys in person at Sweetwater Brewing on TBD, but probably July 28th evening. So start making your plans now. I'm hoping we can do something for the patrons, like maybe get you guys a free beer or something at least. Not sure exactly how that's going to work out, but patrons, we'd love to see you guys there, obviously, as well. All are welcome, though. It should be a fun evening. Whether we do a show or not, it'll just be a fun hangout. And if we do a show, we'll still have a fun hangout after the show's over. So, yeah, guys, you can follow Adnan at Say Which Way. You can follow me at Falcoholic Kevin. Maybe Twitter is imminently going to implode. So I am at Falcoholic Kevin on Threads as well. If we have to merge to Threads at some point, I claim my username over there, so you can follow me there as well. I'll still be posting on Twitter as long as this hell site continues to function adequately. But you never know with Twitter these days. I figure at some point everyone's either it's gonna get fixed or everyone's just gonna leave, and when that happens, we want to be ready. So again, guys, thank you so much for tuning in, for hanging out with us in the middle of the dead zone. We will see you guys very soon next week for our next training camp preview. I'll also have some recorded specific position group training camp previews coming out on the podcast and on the channel over the next couple weeks, getting very into the nitty gritty with each position. We're probably going to cover the big headlines on the live shows, but yeah, guys, thank you so much. We will see you next time on the Falcoholic Live and the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. Until then, have a